Welcome to this explainer. Okay, we're going to completely change the way you look at the map of New York City today. We usually think of a city's waterfront as just a boundary, right? Like it's just a place where the land simply runs out. But what we're going to see is that the coastline of New York City isn't just some static border. It's actually a living, continuously engineered entity that literally built the city as we know it today.
So let's kick things off with a pretty wild thought. What if the ground beneath your feet isn't actually ground at all? Down at places like the Battery, right at the southern tip of Manhattan, the land you're standing on is really just accumulated ship ballast, loose stone, and, well, refuse, layered outward over centuries. Every single generation basically pushed the edge a little farther into the harbor, tossing weight from arriving ships right into the shallows. So those confident, extended edges we walk on today, they're literally built on the debris of global trade. Crazy, right? To wrap our heads around this massive, sprawling waterfront, we're going to track its history through 5 chapters. We'll start with the shifting edge, then move into echoes of 1776, the industrial engine, from ruins to sanctuaries, and wrap up with the enduring harbor. Let's get right into it.
Chapter 1. The Shifting Edge, Building the Foundation.
To really get a feel for how the harbor's shape was defined, we have to look back before all the concrete bulkheads arrived. The original names actually ground the history in the land itself. For example, the Lenape called the Bronx River a Quahung, which translates to River of High Bluffs, and honestly, it perfectly describes the dramatic schist canyons and waterfalls you can still see there today. Then you have the Dutch, who referred to this deep, sheltered inlet over in Brooklyn as Walbocht, or Bend in the Harbor. That eventually evolved into Wallabout Bay, which is the exact geography that made the massive Brooklyn Navy Yard possible later on. Now, looking at this, there's just a stark, undeniable contrast between that natural colonial frontier and the shoreline we see today. The original shoreline was incredibly complex. It was irregular, exposed, full of shallow inlets and tidal mudflats. Fast forward to today, and the shoreline is continuous, hardened by steel and concrete and pushed way out by centuries of massive landfill projects. But as we're about to see, that original jagged coastline, it played an absolutely pivotal role in the founding of the nation.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, Echoes of 1776, the Battlefield.
You see, the sheer complexity of this coastline turned the water into both a deadly trap and a miraculous escape route during the Revolutionary War. Control of New York's waterways basically meant control of the whole war. This led to a rapid succession of defining moments in the summer of 1776. The British show up with one of the largest armadas ever assembled, totally leveraging their naval superiority. But, and this is a huge but, after the disastrous Battle of Long Island, George Washington's Continental Army only survived because of the river. Under the cover of heavy fog and pitch-black darkness, small boats rowed silently across the treacherous East River currents, evacuating the American forces right out of Brooklyn and into Manhattan. And you can feel the absolute desperation of that moment in this quote from George Washington, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." He said this at Gowness Creek, where the famous Maryland 400 tragically sank into the mud. These guys, carrying incredibly heavy muskets and equipment, repeatedly charged British positions across those deadly tidal marshes. And their sacrifice wasn't for nothing. They delayed the British advance just long enough to allow Washington's army to escape, effectively saving the revolution.
But it wasn't just about the big battles. That jagged coastline allowed daring spies and super-resilient civilians to use the local geography to completely turn the tide of the war. I mean, you had Mary Lindley Murray tactically stalling British officers with tea for 2 critical hours at Kipps Bay just so retreating Americans could slip right by. You had the guns of Fort Defiance over in Red Hook raking British warships to keep the escape lanes open, and you had Patriot whaleboatmen silently rowing across Long Island Sound under the cover of darkness to run intelligence and smuggle supplies. Just incredible stuff.
Okay, let's fast forward to Chapter 3, The Industrial Engine, Powering the City.
Moving into the 19th and 20th centuries, the water's edge transformed into this place of staggering industrial output. For generations, the harbor was purely an economic engine, packed with this wild variety of massive waterfront industries that physically built the wealth of the whole region. You had the Domino Sugar Refinery dominating Williamsburg, literally filling the air with the smell of caramelized sugar. Up north, the Lorillard Snuff Mill harnessed the Bronx River's power to grind tobacco. Over at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, they were operating around the clock during World War II. And then there was the monumental Red Hook grain terminal, rising 10 stories above the harbor, like this massive cathedral of the barge canal trade.
To really put this industrial boom into perspective, get a load of this number: 300,000. In 1885, a staggering 300,000 pounds of dynamite was used to blow up flood rock to clear the treacherous Hellgate Passage. Actually, scratch that. It wasn't just a big explosion. It was the largest controlled explosion in human history prior to the atomic age. They literally blew up an entire island to reshape the East River's dangerous navigational channels for industrial shipping.
And what's wild is how modern development has literally paved right over the brutal labor and massive infrastructure of our harbor's past. Take Red Hook, for instance. Graving Dock Number 1 operated there since the Civil War. It's actually where they repaired the famous ironclad USS Monitor. Well, today, that exact historic spot is buried entirely beneath the parking lot of the world's largest IKEA. It's crazy to think about, but our modern conveniences are built directly on top of our industrial memory.
That brings us to Chapter 4, From Ruins to Sanctuaries, the Ecological Rebirth.
So, let's dive into this post-industrial transformation, where the city is fighting tooth and nail to reclaim its damaged ecology from centuries of abuse. We're talking a massive shift from toxic Superfund sites to some truly miraculous environmental comebacks. Decades of industrial waste turned the Gowanus Canal into this infamous lavender lake of chemical dyes. And even today, Newtown Creek sits above millions of gallons of spilled oil. But then, look at the Bronx River. It's New York City's only freshwater river. Thanks to some fiercely dedicated community restoration, we've actually seen the return of Jose the Beaver, the first beaver spotted there in 2 centuries. And it gets better. By 2023, dolphins were actually seen swimming in its waters. Dolphins? No way, right?
Now, the challenges are huge. Back in the mid-20th century, 80 entire acres of historic salt marsh were completely buried under the Soundview Park landfill, just covered up. But community-driven restoration groups are actively fighting to bring that marshland back. They are out there right now digging out old WP-era rubble just to let the tide flow back in, proving that, yeah, we can actually undo some of this damage.
And despite centuries of heavy industry, fragments of the original coastal ecology actually survived and are being nurtured back to health. Out in Jamaica Bay, diamondback terrapins are nesting in the brackish water again. Up in the Bronx, the Thane family forest preserves old-growth tulip trees that were ancient before the Dutch even set foot here. Fiddler crabs are scattering across those restored Soundview mudflats we just talked about, and osprey are raising their young on tall platforms towering right over the marshes. It's like nature's finally getting a second wind.
Let's wrap things up with Chapter 5, The Enduring Harbor, Looking Forward.
As we bring this explainer to a close, let's look at how the water is constantly being reshaped for the city's future needs. The waterfront isn't some museum piece. It remains a working, living entity. It's transitioning away from those old freight and cargo systems and moving toward public parks, commutes, and offshore wind infrastructure. We've taken these massive old rail gantries in Long Island City and turned them into stunning public plazas at Gantry State Park. The NYC ferry network has brought commuter transit right back to the water, kind of reviving an era from before all those massive suspension bridges. And industrial sites like the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal are being adapted right now to stage the entire region's renewable offshore wind infrastructure.
I love this quote. The Bronx River is proof that given half a chance, nature finds a way back. Ultimately, the harbor's just incredibly resilient. It has survived a literal revolution, heavy industry, immense pollution, and massive, massive infrastructure projects. Now it's really up to us to decide what its next life will be.
So, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to ponder the next time you cross a bridge or stand on a pier anywhere in the city. What will the city's edge look like in another 250 years? Will the edge retreat? Will it be further fortified with giant seawalls? Or will it return closer to that wild, tidal ecosystem the Lenape originally navigated? The shoreline is a continuous draft, and right now, we're the ones holding the pen. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep your eyes on the water.